What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily. So this is the top tier Samsung A series phone this year, the A54. And this was the top tier Samsung A series phone last year, the A73. An A74 doesn't seem to be coming this year. So if you have last year's A73, do you upgrade to this new A54? Or if you have an even older phone or lesser A series device, maybe an A23 or A33, which one of these should you get? Is the A54 a better phone than the A73, even though it's technically a tier lower? Well, that's what I hope to answer for you in this video. I've had my A73 for more than a year now, so I'm pretty familiar with it. And I've had this A54 basically since it first came out a few months ago. And using them both now, I actually feel that the choice is pretty clear. The A54 is the better device almost all the way around. I'll explain why I feel that way, of course, but the gist of it is that the A54 this year just offers so much with its specs and features that I genuinely don't even see how Samsung could have released an A74 or an S23 FE for that matter without stepping on the toes of their flagship phones. Now, price-wise, the A54 is technically a $450 phone, but it's almost always on sale from places like Amazon, usually for $50 off. The A73, on the other hand, was like a $550 device when it first launched last year, but it's depreciated quite a lot since then. Though interestingly enough, it's often still selling for more than the A54. So price is certainly the first thing to consider with these two phones. They're priced similarly, depending on where in the world you live and what kind of carrier deal you might be able to get. Those can be a factor. I'm going to say they're about $400-ish, but if you want to do some comparison shopping of your own, I'll leave links down below in the video description to where you can get both of these phones at their cheapest current prices. So if you like a big phone, there really wasn't anything much bigger than the A73. At 6.7 inches, it towers over the A54, which actually shrunk in size compared to its predecessor. And in fact, at 6.4 inches corner to corner, it's a smidge smaller than average. Also, you might be able to tell that the A54's display has thicker black borders surrounding it, so you get a lesser screen to body ratio and less screen real estate overall compared to the A73. In the hand though, the A54 is arguably quite a bit more comfortable and manageable, and I think more than anything, this is just a personal preference thing. Around back, Samsung actually upped the build quality and the design with the A54. Not only does it have a premium all-glass back panel versus the A73's plastic housing, but it also now looks identical to Samsung's $800 S series phones, specifically because of the camera lens setup. So if you were self-conscious about using an A series phone, now no one can really tell. And in my opinion, the matte frame on the A54 also looks more modern versus the shiny polished chrome on the A73. The premium materials and altered design are just superficial changes, though. You don't get any additional features or functionality like wireless charging or better water resistance rating, so take that for what it's worth. And there aren't really any differences with the buttons, ports, or anything else either. Both phones support expandable storage with a micro SD card slot. They both lack a headphone jack. There's a dual speaker setup on both too. The A54 has one less camera lens. Samsung dropped the depth sensor, but that's not really a big deal, and I'll talk more about the pictures and videos in just a bit. Something else surprisingly similar, the fingerprint sensors. Both phones have the in-display fingerprint reader, and they both wake and unlock practically at the exact same time. I thought maybe the A54 would have been a little quicker, but nope. And the face unlock is more or less the same too. Now, aside from the obvious size difference, the displays on these two phones differ in a couple more ways. To put it simply, the display on the A54 is a bolder, brighter Super AMOLED panel with HDR10 Plus content support. The display on the A73 is also AMOLED, but it doesn't quite get as bright and has no HDR content support, it seems. But the A73 is certainly still quite good. They're both 1080 resolution displays. They're both 120 Hz. The A54 though is an adaptive high refresh rate, so it's often more fluid and responsive in some instances while conserving battery life in other instances with a lower refresh rate when appropriate. Overall, the displays on Samsung's upper tier A series phones, like these, are, in my opinion, still the top reason to buy them. They've always been really good, but this year, the A54's display is darn near identical spec-wise to, again, Samsung's flagship S23, which is just crazy. It's a relatively minor upgrade over the A74 by comparison, but it just takes it up one more notch. Now, it would be inappropriate for me to not at least mention the fact that, yeah, the much bigger screen on the A73 is handy, and the slimmer bezels are nice too, but I personally care most about screen quality, and the A54 this year has what I consider to be literally a flagship caliper screen for half the price, with some spec bumps that do make it an upgrade as well. When it comes to the speaker setup, I'm not aware of any changes at all with a downward or secondary speaker on the A54. I think Samsung has been reusing the same speaker hardware for years now, and with a quick sound test, I'm not hearing a substantial difference that would sway me either way, but have a listen and you can decide for yourself. Okay, so let's get into some important stuff, specs and performance. Now, I'm not going to beat around the bush. I and a lot of other people feel that the processor Samsung chose for this new A54 was probably a bad choice. It's powered by Samsung's own Exynos 1380, paired with either 6 or 8 gigs of RAM. The A73, on the other hand, got the solid Snapdragon 778G 5G chipset, also paired with either 6 or 8 gigs of RAM. Here are the Geekbench scores for those two phones, and you can see the A73 on the right eked out a win with the single-core and multi-core performance tests. And I don't think that's surprising. Even though the Snapdragon processor in the A73 is a year and a half older, the Exynos 1380 was announced basically when the A54 came out, we know Qualcomm's chipsets in general are more efficient overall. Samsung's Exynos processors are just not really known to be as powerful or as good as Qualcomm's Snapdragon ones of a similar tier. And I actually think a lot of people to this day swear off any and all Exynos processors, even the new ones, because of the throttling, overheating, and efficiency issues of past Exynos phones. Now, I'm not saying the A54 itself has any glaring performance issues. In fact, I think it performs relatively well. However, more often than not, the A73 launches and loads things quicker, especially when the app or game is pretty graphics heavy or intense, and certainly as more and more apps get loaded up and run in the background. And that's sort of unusual if you think about it. Regardless of the tier, A50 something versus A70 something, you'd think Samsung would have made the A54 decisively better than a previous released top-end A-series phone, but in this case they didn't, or maybe they couldn't. Now, is any of this really going to matter in day-to-day use? Probably not. I mean, we're talking about fractions of a second of speed difference, only in certain apps and certain situations. But if you are one of those people who is very picky about performance, and you've sworn off Exynos processors anyway, this is an instance where I'll say, yeah, the A73 performance-wise is probably the better choice still. The one thing you're going to miss out on in sticking with the A73 is one less year of major Android updates since it's a year older device. But still, both these phones are going to have 3 or 4 more years of full software support and plenty of life left in them beyond that. But maybe that further cements the idea that keeping the A73, if you have it, or buying one right now, is a pretty good move still. Now, to Samsung's credit, for whatever reason, battery life seems to be slightly better on the A54 compared to the A73. Not drastically so, and I think part of that just has to do with the A73's massive screen and maybe less efficient, slightly older AMOLED panel taking up a bit more juice in the process. They both have the same size 5,000 milliamp battery inside. They both charge at the same 25 watt wired speeds from a plug you'll have to supply yourself, and neither has wireless charging capabilities. So it's all even there, but you can probably get maybe 10 to 15% more life out of the A54 on any given day, though that's obviously going to vary person to person based on your usage. Finally, when it comes to the cameras, this actually ended up being one of the more drastic differences between these two phones, and at first I was sort of surprised, since spec-wise and feature-wise, there's not that much that's been changed or added or otherwise upgraded to the A54. But the actual picture samples speak for themselves, and when you think about how these phone companies literally are only concerned with camera stuff nowadays, I guess it makes sense. Around back, the A73 actually had a crazy 108 megapixel main lens. The A54 is only a 50 megapixel lens, but megapixels don't really tell the whole story. The secondary ultra-wide lenses are a similar 12 megapixel spec. There's still a 5 megapixel macro lens on each. Like I mentioned, the depth sensor was dropped from the A54, which is fine, not really necessary nowadays for portrait pics, and the selfie cameras actually seem to be the same 32 megapixel shooters on both. There really isn't anything inside the camera apps that differentiates the two phones, no additional features either way, no new capabilities for the A54, nothing that was missing on the A73. The high megapixel shooting modes differ obviously since the two phones have different megapixel main lenses, but that's sort of it. And with some real world shots here, this is pretty much where you'll see the difference. The A54 is just the better picture taker in every situation. The images look better, they're more balanced, the dynamic range is so much better, they're not as overexposed in bright conditions, not as dark and fuzzy and dimly lit shots. I really think a lot of this is just software. I mean, the processor and the camera hardware aren't that much better on the A54 after all, so maybe Samsung is just doing a lot of artificial correcting, but whatever the case is, the A54 looks a lot less budget with its pictures. And if that's something that's important to you, I think the A54 is going to be a winner there. So overall, the A54, in my opinion, is the better phone almost entirely. I like that it's a little smaller, personally. It's got a nicer build with a new design. It literally looks like Samsung's $800 S23, and it has the specs to mimic it too. Better display, better camera. It's not the better phone performance-wise, though, which is odd. That's not a deal breaker. It's not going to affect 95% of people on a daily basis, but it's still something to consider. If you have an A73, I don't really think there's any reason to get an A54 right now, but if you have any other device, I do think the A54 probably makes more sense to get. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.